Clayton Kershaw had never said it before. Not once. Not in 3 Cy Young Awards. Not in 17 seasons wearing Dodger blue. Not through the championships and the heartbreaks and the October nights that defined and sometimes devastated the career of the greatest pitcher his generation produced. Through all of it, Kershaw had maintained the particular kind of silence that elite competitors maintain about the inner workings of what they feel toward their teammates, toward the game, toward the things that happen inside a clubhouse that the outside world only ever sees the edges of. He had never said it. Until now. And when he finally did, the words landed in the American sports media like something that had been building for a very long time without anyone realizing how much pressure had accumulated behind them. The one who's hurting the most is fighting the hardest. That was the sentence. Simple enough on the surface. The kind of thing that gets said in locker rooms and post-game interviews and motivational contexts without anyone stopping to examine it too carefully. But this was Clayton Kershaw saying it. About Shohei Ohtani. In a moment when Ohtani's knee was the story the entire baseball world was orbiting, when the surgery had just happened and the diagnosis had just been delivered and the phrase "once damaged it can't be healed" was still fresh enough to sting. And Clayton Kershaw, who has competed through injuries that would have ended other careers, who has pitched through pain that he never fully disclosed until years after the fact, who understands in his body what it means to be a competitor whose physical limits are constantly being tested against his competitive will, Clayton Kershaw looked at Shohei Ohtani and saw something in him that moved him enough to finally speak. That was what the American media couldn't stop talking about. Not just what he said, but the fact that he said it at all. To understand why this revelation carried the weight that it did, you have to understand what Clayton Kershaw represents inside that Dodgers clubhouse. He is not simply a veteran. He is not simply a former ace making space for the next generation in the quiet and gracious way that great players sometimes do when their peak years are behind them. Kershaw is something more specific than that. He is the institutional memory of an entire franchise. He is the standard against which every Dodger pitcher has been measured for nearly 2 decades. He is the person in that building who has seen the most, endured the most, and by virtue of all of that, whose words carry a weight that no amount of recent statistics can manufacture. When Kershaw speaks about a teammate, people listen differently than they listen to anyone else in that clubhouse. When Kershaw speaks about Shohei Ohtani, the room goes quiet in a way that it doesn't go quiet for anyone. The revelation came in the context of a broader conversation about the Dodgers' current situation. About how the team was processing Ohtani's injury. About the atmosphere in the clubhouse in the days following the surgery. About whether a team built so deliberately around one player's presence could find its identity in a moment when that presence was suddenly, painfully uncertain. Kershaw had been asked, carefully, what he had observed in Ohtani during this period. What the private version of Shohei Ohtani looked like when the cameras weren't on him and the home run replays weren't playing on the stadium screens and there was nothing to do but sit with what the doctors had found and figure out how to move forward. He didn't answer immediately. That pause, familiar to anyone who has watched enough Kershaw interviews to know that he processes before he speaks, that he doesn't perform thoughtfulness but actually practices it, stretched just long enough to signal that what was coming wasn't a prepared answer. The one who's hurting the most, he said, is fighting the hardest. And then he elaborated. Not extensively. Not in the way of someone who wanted to make a speech or claim credit for an insight. But enough. Enough to make it clear that what he had seen in Ohtani during the days following the diagnosis was something that had genuinely affected him. Something that had reminded him of things he knew about competition and pain and the particular kind of person who refuses to let the size of the obstacle determine the size of the response. He had watched Ohtani in that training room. He had watched him in the moments between the official appointments and the medical assessments and the organizational conversations about timelines and protocols. He had watched him in the small spaces of a day where there is nothing productive to do except wait and process and decide what kind of competitor you are going to be when the thing you love doing has been taken from you without warning. And what he saw had moved Clayton Kershaw. That alone told you everything you needed to know. But the revelation about Ohtani was only half of what Kershaw said. The other half was where things got complicated. Because somewhere in that same conversation, in the same honest and unguarded register that had produced the words about Ohtani, Kershaw allowed something else to surface. Something that had clearly been sitting with him for longer than the duration of a single interview. Something about the defensive play in recent games. Something about Max Muncy specifically, and about other defenders whose positioning and execution had not met the standard that Kershaw holds, and has always held, for what it means to play behind a pitcher who is trusting you with every ball he doesn't strike out. He didn't call anyone out by name in the way that becomes a headline and a controversy and a clubhouse rift that needs to be managed publicly. He is too experienced for that, too aware of how those moments play out, too invested in the actual relationships inside that building to burn them for the sake of a moment of unfiltered honesty in front of a microphone. But the frustration was there. Audible. Unmistakable. The kind that surfaces when someone who has dedicated their entire professional life to a standard of excellence watches that standard not being met in moments that matter. Muncy is not a villain in this story. That needs to be said clearly. He is a professional baseball player operating at the highest level of a sport that humbles everyone eventually. He has had stretches of brilliance and stretches of difficulty, and he has worn a Dodgers uniform through both without complaint. What Kershaw's comments pointed toward was not a character assessment of Max Muncy as a person or even as a player in the broadest sense. It was something more specific. More situational. The particular frustration of a competitor who has spent 17 years understanding that pitching is not just about what happens between the pitcher and the catcher, that the 9 people behind him are equal participants in whether his work produces the result it deserves. When that compact is broken, even slightly, even in ways that the box score doesn't fully capture, a step too slow, a read that comes a fraction of a second late, a positioning decision that leaves a gap where there shouldn't be one, Kershaw feels it. Has always felt it. Will always feel it, because that is simply who he is and has always been. The anger, such as it was, wasn't personal. It was professional in the deepest sense of that word. The American media, predictably, did not treat it that way. By the time the coverage had cycled through its full rotation, the initial reports, the reaction pieces, the takes built on takes until the original words were barely visible beneath the layers of interpretation, the story had become something considerably larger and more dramatic than what Kershaw had actually said. Clubhouse tension. Veteran frustration. The fault lines within a championship contender. The question of whether a team that had built its identity around Shohei Ohtani was beginning to show the pressure fractures that emerge when the thing holding everything together is suddenly in a hospital receiving a diagnosis that nobody wanted to hear. Some of that framing was unfair to the nuance of what Kershaw had actually expressed. Some of it, in the way that media coverage sometimes accidentally identifies something real while reaching for something dramatic, was not entirely wrong either. There is something worth sitting with in the pairing of those two things Kershaw said. The tenderness of his observation about Ohtani. The edge in his words about the defensive execution around him. On the surface they seem like separate subjects, separate emotional registers, almost contradictory in their texture. But they come from exactly the same place. They come from a man who has spent 17 years caring about baseball with an intensity that most people cannot fully access. Who has given that game his shoulder and his back and portions of his body that will carry the record of that giving long after his career is a memory. Who has watched, from within the closest possible proximity, what genuine athletic sacrifice looks like when it is happening in real time. He watched Ohtani hit 22 home runs on a knee that was carrying damage the doctors described as irreversible. He watched him take the mound and compete and refuse to show what was happening inside the joint on every plant and drive and rotation. He watched him do what competitors do when they have decided that what they love is worth more than what it is costing them. And then he watched the people around him, the defenders, the support structure, the teammates whose execution either honors or undermines the sacrifice being made, and found moments where the standard wasn't matching the moment. The frustration and the reverence are the same feeling. Pointed in two different directions. Kershaw did not walk back what he said. That matters. That is itself a statement, in the careful world of professional sports communication where walking things back is always available as an option and is frequently exercised within hours of anything that generates friction. He said what he said. He stood behind it in the way that people stand behind things when they meant them, when the words came from somewhere real rather than from a moment of unguarded miscalculation. The U.S. media stirred because Kershaw stirring is news. Because when the most decorated pitcher in Dodgers history decides that something is worth saying publicly, the decision itself is the story before a single word of the content is even processed. But underneath the media cycle, underneath the takes and the reactions and the hot stove analysis that followed, something quieter and more durable was sitting. A man who has spent 17 years fighting through his own pain watched the person who is currently fighting the hardest through his own, and was moved enough to say so out loud for the first time. The one who's hurting the most is fighting the hardest. Clayton Kershaw has earned the right to recognize that. Because he has been that person too. And watching Shohei Ohtani in those training room moments, in those private spaces between the diagnosis and whatever comes next, he saw something in him that looked, in the most essential way, like looking in a mirror.